Welcome to the Security Nexus Deep Dive. The Security Nexus is a Maryland-based national security consultancy specializing in strategic advisory, education, and public engagement. Through podcasts, blogs, training, and consulting, we provide insight into the evolving landscape of cyber threats, hybrid warfare, and strategic security policy. Our mission is to inform, educate, and empower professionals and the public through clear, accessible, and actionable knowledge. Visit thesecuritynexus.net to learn more. All right, let's get right into this explainer. We've got a wild paradox to unpack today regarding early Cold War espionage. Specifically, we're looking at Soviet foreign intelligence between 1945 and 1965. Now, the central argument we're exploring here is that their track record, it wasn't just some straightforward story of institutional competence. It was actually this crazy period where staggering, world-changing operational successes coexisted with severe, almost crippling institutional chaos. To really understand how that's possible, we're pulling this apart using a brilliant article by the Security Nexus called The Chekist Craft, Part 5, The Cold War Turns the Legends into Liabilities. That article takes a deep dive into an official SVR history book, specifically Volume 5 of the History of Russian Foreign Intelligence, edited by Yevgeny M. Premykov. This volume covers the massive transformation of Soviet foreign intelligence from a temporary wartime setup into a permanent, entrenched Cold War institution. Because it's an official history, it hands us some incredible operational evidence. But as you'll see, we really have to view it through an analytical lens to separate the documented facts from their own institutional spin. Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We're going to hit the Cold War pivot, the institutional roller coaster, the official narrative, Philby and the Cambridge Five, George Blake and the assets, and finally, the era's legacy. Let's jump in. Section 1. The Cold War pivot. Picture it, 1945. The dust is barely settling on World War II. You think everyone could take a breath, right? Wrong. The US, the UK, and the Soviet Union, who literally just teamed up to crush fascism, fractured almost overnight. Suddenly, they're Cold War adversaries, completely divided by conflicting geopolitical interests. The game for foreign intelligence flipped instantly. They were no longer fighting a hot war together. They were fighting a high-stakes shadow war against each other. So what drove this sudden shift? Well, the official history points a finger straight at the West's aggressive post-war posture. They cite Winston Churchill dropping his famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946. Then comes the Truman Doctrine in 47, aimed at containing the Soviets, followed by the birth of NATO. But the real kicker? Western atomic strike plans. For Soviet intelligence, the stakes weren't just about battlefield tactics anymore. This was literally about national survival in the atomic age. Moving on to Section 2, the official narrative. Now, how does the SVR actually look back at this intense era? Their official history claims that if you comb through their internal archives, you will find absolutely zero evidence of aggressive Soviet intentions. They frame their entire operation as purely defensive, just trying to keep the peace against a hostile West. But let's challenge this a bit. There is a huge limitation in using an intelligence service's own files to definitively judge the broader intent of the state. Intelligence agencies execute policy, They don't always document the aggressive grand strategies of their political leadership. So while the operational facts in this book are gold, this claim of pure defensiveness, that's a highly selective institutional narrative. A massive piece of that narrative revolves around something called drop shot. The official history leans heavily on this 1949 U.S. military scenario, which mapped out dropping hundreds of atomic bombs on the Soviet Union. And Soviet intelligence actually got their hands on these plans. Now, whether drop shot was an imminent attack plan or just a theoretical war game doesn't really matter. For Moscow, it was the ultimate smoking gun. It completely fueled the aggressive expansion of their spy networks to counter what they saw as an existential threat. Which brings us to Section 3, the institutional roller coaster. You would assume that facing an existential atomic threat, the Soviet intelligence apparatus would be a well-oiled machine, right? Absolutely not. It was bureaucratic whiplash. In just 7 years, they went through 4 massive structural upheavals. First, in 1947, they mashed political and military intelligence together into the Committee of Information. That was too clunky, so by 49, they ripped military intelligence back out. In 51, foreign intel gets shoved under the Ministry of State Security as the first chief directorate. Then Stalin dies in 53, and Lavrenti Beria kicks off this destructive internal purge, recalling seasoned case officers and basically abandoning networks. Finally, in 1954, the modern KGB is born. Talk about chaos. So it begs the question, how on earth do you run the world's most successful spy ring while your own headquarters is literally tearing itself apart? The crazy answer is that they survived despite the system. Their operational success during this period relied almost entirely on the sheer individual discipline of the case officers, and honestly, the unmatched value of their human assets planted deep in the West. Let's look at those high-value assets in Section 4, Philby and the Cambridge Five. These five guys were arguably the most damaging spy ring in history. We're talking about long-term, ideological assets placed at the absolute peak of the British establishment. You had Donald Maclean sitting in the UK Foreign Office handling atomic secrets, and Kim Philby deeply embedded inside SIS, British Foreign Intelligence. They were feeding the Soviets real-time, unfiltered access to Western strategy. To really grasp how valuable they were, look at Philby's brilliant, if sinister, maneuver in 1951. Philby finds out that British domestic intelligence, MI5, is finally closing in on his fellow spy, Donald Maclean. Operating out of Washington, Philby uses his senior position to completely derail the investigation. He gets Guy Burgess, another spy in the ring, to act as a courier to warn Maclean over in London. And to cover his own tracks, Philby sends official warning memos back to London using incredibly slow diplomatic pouches. He literally bought Maclean the time he needed to escape to Moscow while building a perfect paper trail alibi for himself. He wasn't just observing the investigation, he was actively steering it. There's this great quote from author and former SIS officer Graham Greene that hits the nail on the head. He said, when Philby reached the peak of his career, any initiative by Western intelligence was doomed in advance. That is the devastating power of an ideological asset. Philby's individual cunning saved the network right when his own handlers in Moscow were dealing with purges and chaos. That brings us to Section 5, George Blake and the assets. Philby wasn't the only one proving how lethal insider betrayal can be. Enter George Blake, another British intelligence officer secretly working for the Soviets. Like Philby, Blake was a counterintelligence goldmine. He protected Soviet networks and exposed countless Western agents operating behind the Iron Curtain. But here's where we have to look at how these networks actually fall apart. Blake thrived for a decade. Meanwhile, over in the US, a legendary Soviet illegal named Rudolf Abel, whose real name was actually William Fisher, was completely compromised. And get this, it wasn't because of some superior Western counterintelligence sweep. He was exposed because his own subordinate, Reino Heihanen, defected and gave him up. It's a huge lesson. The biggest threat to these networks wasn't the enemy's tech, it was insider betrayal. In fact, that exact same dynamic, defectors talking, is what eventually brought down Blake and even Philby years later. But before Blake's luck ran out, he handed Moscow an unbelievable gift regarding Operation Gold. You might know it as the Berlin Tunnel. This was this massive, highly technical joint US-UK operation to dig under Berlin and physically tap into Soviet military communications. It was an absolute technological marvel for the West. But because they had George Blake on the inside, the Soviets knew all about the tunnel before the first shovel even hit the dirt. They actually let the West build the whole thing just to protect Blake's cover. They just fed the tap a careful mix of harmless truths and subtle disinformation, completely neutralizing the West's technological edge. Finally, Section 6, the era's legacy. Drawing on the security nexus's deep dive, what are our three main takeaways from this wild era? First, institutional instability can absolutely coexist with major operational success. The Soviet system was a bureaucratic nightmare, but the discipline of individual case officers kept the mission alive. Second, insider betrayal is almost always more damaging than an adversary's tech or investigative skills. From Philby crippling SIS, to Blake neutralizing the Berlin Tunnel, to Heihanen giving up Rudolf Abel, the human element is the ultimate vulnerability. And third, official intelligence histories are tricky. They offer incredibly valuable operational evidence, but they are also advancing a selective institutional narrative. We always have to separate the facts from the spin. I'll leave you with this to chew on. If endless reorganizations, brutal purges, and systemic chaos couldn't defeat these Soviet intelligence networks, what is the true devastating cost of an insider's betrayal? It's a terrifying vulnerability, and one that every modern intelligence agency still wrestles with today. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. I want to once again credit the Security Nexus for their fantastic analysis. Make sure to visit thesecuritynexus.net for more podcasts, analysis, training, and consulting. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.